Welcome to the Reflective Leader Podcast, where we hold up a mirror and explore how we live, how we lead, and who we're becoming along the way. I'm your host, Krista Johnson. Over the last several months, I've experienced some pretty significant change in my career. So I've recently stepped into a new role. I left Saks Global and joined a new organization. And I entered a season of transition that has stretched me in ways that have felt exciting and meaningful, and at times deeply uncomfortable. But we know that no true growth or expansion comes without a little discomfort. I've been having conversations about the topic for today's podcast with peers, with coaching clients, with friends, and within myself for the past few months as I was approaching this transition. And the more I reflected on it, the more I realized this felt like the right moment to have a more honest conversation about what leadership feels like right now, specifically the emotional weight of leadership. So, in addition to that, recently I attended the Women in Retail Leadership Summit in Miami, the most amazing conference, and I found myself thinking about that experience ever since I returned home. There was something incredibly grounding and just wonderful about being in a room full of intelligent and thoughtful and ambitious women who are carrying a lot in different ways. There are women leading large teams and large functions while also navigating life outside of work, of course. There were women trying to show up as strong leaders and subject matter experts, but also supportive partners and friends, daughters, sisters, mothers, and just human beings who are trying to take care of ourselves while remain connected to who we really are throughout all of this. So as I sat in those rooms and listened to those speakers, and I also talked with leaders and colleagues between sessions, I started reflecting on my own season of transition. And I also realized how so many leaders are carrying an enormous amount emotionally right now. We've talked about this in the podcast, but there is so much complexity happening inside organizations and the world more broadly. We've got economic uncertainty, rapid transformation, technological changes like AI, pressure to move faster, pressure to perform, pressure to stay steady, all while helping other people navigate uncertainty at the same time as leaders. And I think many leaders are carrying all of this kind of privately. What the Women in Retail Leadership Conference reminded me of, though, is while leadership can feel heavy at times, we were never meant to carry it alone. There was something so deeply powerful about being surrounded by women who kind of understand the emotional weight of leadership and what it feels like to carry responsibility for outcomes and culture and teams and our people that are in our care, while also quietly managing our own humanity in the background. I left Miami and the World Conference thinking a lot about that, about the emotional weight leaders carry, why leadership can feel isolating at times, and why leadership can feel especially heavy and how it feels in this current moment. And maybe most importantly, what helps leaders carry that weight in a healthy, in a grounded, and in a sustainable way. So today, I want to explore the emotional weight of leadership. What creates it, what makes it feel heavy sometimes, and what it looks like to build the kind of grounding, relationships, and reflective practices that help us carry leadership without losing ourselves in the process. As leaders, we are surrounded by people all day long. We are in meetings constantly. I know you feel this way. We're talking with teams, with our peers, with stakeholders, sometimes customers if we're in customer-facing roles, other executives. Our calendars are full. Our phones are buzzing, Teams, Ping, Slack, and we are interacting with people nonstop. And yet, emotionally, many leaders feel deeply alone inside our systems and with what we're carrying. I came across a video recently from someone on Instagram. I think she was just kind of sharing her perspective of how she felt. And she was describing this experience, and it stopped me in my tracks because it articulated something I think so many leaders quietly feel but rarely say out loud. She talked about how she spends her day managing the emotions of everyone around her while simultaneously pushing her own emotions down so she can remain calm and composed in the middle of, the chaos that is her calendar. She talked about absorbing frustrations from people about decisions, systems, or circumstances that are often outside of her control. She talked about replaying difficult conversations afterward, wondering, was I too harsh? Was I too soft? Did I handle that correctly? And what also struck me was that the way she described feeling like she had nowhere safe to put any of this. Because if she vents downward, she risks creating stress or instability for her team. If she vents upward, she worries her leaders may question her capability or maybe even her long-term leadership potential. And then venting sideways is difficult because we know peer relationships inside organizations are often complicated. They can be competitive, they can be political, or they can just plain be guarded. So instead, many leaders simply hold it all in. They're carrying the pressure of making difficult decisions that they know may disappoint someone, no matter how thoughtfully they approach them. They're carrying responsibility for outcomes they don't fully control. And they're also carrying the emotional tone of their teams while privately navigating their own journey. And because leadership often requires steadiness, many leaders, me included, have become incredibly skilled at appearing composed externally while emotionally feeling overloaded or dysregulated. I've also seen leadership change relationships in subtle ways over time. And what I mean by that is, as leaders rise in organizations, conversations can become more filtered. So feedback can become less direct, or leaders themselves may begin holding things more privately because they feel responsible for maintaining that confidence and that clarity and that steadiness for the people around them. And what can happen over time is this really interesting paradox. Leaders become increasingly visible professionally and inside their organizations, while simultaneously feeling less and less emotionally known by those around them. People in their org, they know their title, they know their role, they have a sense of their responsibilities, and they may even know a bit about their performance. But fewer people actually know what it feels like to be them and how they feel. And I think that's part of what creates that emotional loneliness inside of leadership. Not simply responsibility itself, but responsibility carried in isolation, especially in modern organizations where the pace is fast and we know the pressure's high. And many of us feel like we need to have the answer all the time, to always remain composed or always need to project that certainty. And let's be super clear about this. I do not think that leadership is inherently negative or even emotionally draining all the time. If you know me in real life or you listen to this podcast, you know I am madly in love with leadership. There is incredible meaning and purpose in being a leader. There is so much joy for me in developing people, building culture, creating impact, and helping teams accomplish meaningful things together. But I do think we need to talk more honestly about the emotional labor leadership requires. Because leadership today is not just operational work. It is deeply emotional work. It requires leaders to constantly regulate ourselves while absorbing complexity, navigating human dynamics, and making decisions that impact real people while still remaining grounded enough to lead thoughtfully. And if leaders do not have the right support systems in place and relationships and grounding practices to support us, that emotional labor can quietly begin turning into emotional isolation. I keep coming back to a concept from Brené Brown's recent book, and she really shared something that stayed with me. So in this book, she shares a story about injuring herself while playing pickleball. The way that she tells the story is almost funny at first because she describes herself diving into this sport and this really intense, with this energy that was competitive. So she's pushing hard, she's moving fast, she's trying to keep up, trying to perform well, and trying to win. And eventually, she injured herself pretty badly. But when she went to a trainer during the recovery process, He explained that the injury itself was not actually the root problem. What she was experiencing was more of a compensation injury. So essentially, her body had started compensating for weakness and instability somewhere deeper in the foundation, particularly around her core and the surrounding support structures. Her smaller muscles were overworking and overcompensating for muscles and systems that were not functioning the way that her body really needed them to. And eventually, her body broke down because muscles that were never meant to carry that kind of load long term were trying to do way too much. So, the trainer that she was working with did not immediately focus on fixing the injury so she could get back into her beloved pickleball as quickly as possible. Instead, he focused on rebuilding the foundation, her foundation correctly. He essentially tells her in the book, we're not going to continue building on dysfunction. We're going to slow down, we're going to strengthen your core muscles, and then we'll rebuild from a stronger foundation. And of course, this metaphor is so relevant for leadership because I think many leaders unknowingly begin compensating in similar ways emotionally. Over time, leaders can become so focused on holding everything together that they slowly drift away from themselves in the process. They begin overfunctioning, overcarrying, emotionally bracing, or just trying to maintain that constant composure because somewhere along the way, they learned that leadership meant always being the steady one, the strong one, the capable one, and we get rewarded for that. And externally, those patterns can sometimes look like strength, and they do. But internally, they are often incredibly difficult to sustain. That's why I find Brené's concept of strong ground and this athletic stance she talks about so powerful. She says in her book, maintaining an athletic stance is not about being rigid or stiff. It's about grounded agility. It's a strong core paired with flexibility, it's balance, it's responsiveness, and it's the ability to stay connected to yourself while still moving with what's happening around you. And I'm not an athlete, but I know athletes don't stand completely locked up because rigidity actually increases the likelihood of injury for them. They stay grounded, they stay centered while remaining flexible enough to pivot, adjust, and respond in real time, regardless of the sport. And again, this connects to leadership because strong leadership is not about emotional hardness or rigidity. It's not about pretending everything is fine all the time. And it's definitely not about silently carrying everything alone while slowly disconnecting from yourself underneath the role. Real strength is staying grounded without becoming rigid. It's having enough self-awareness to notice when you are compensating instead of responding intentionally. It's recognizing when you're emotionally armoring up instead of genuinely connecting with another person. It's knowing how to pause, reconnect with yourself, and return to center instead of constantly operating from tension, from pressure, and overperformance, which is something I know a little about. And I think that maybe one of the most important leadership lessons of this current moment is strong leaders are not leaders who never get knocked off center. Strong leaders are leaders who know how to return to center. They know how to reconnect with themselves underneath the pressure of the role, and they know how to build relationships and practices and support systems that help them stay grounded emotionally, relationally, and mentally over time. Leadership was never meant to require constant self-abandonment in order to sustain it, and it's something I've wrestled with a lot. It leads us to the question, if leadership can feel emotionally heavy and isolating at times, what actually helps leaders carry it in a healthier and a more sustainable way? One of the most important answers to that question is relationships. The relationships leaders have with other people and the relationships leaders have with themselves. Because leadership becomes incredibly difficult to sustain when leaders are disconnected from both. As I've reflected on this more deeply, I think that there are three things in particular that help me and help leaders carry leadership differently and in a sustainable way. So let's look at those. The first is building trusted alliances and relationships inside your system. The second is building trusted, grounding relationships outside of your system. And this is what I think of as your personal board of directors. The third is creating intentional, reflective spaces through coaching or other forms of meaningful developmental support. Let's start with the first one, which is building trusted alliances and relationships inside your organization or your system. And this is where Patrick Lencioni's concept of first team becomes incredibly important. So if you're not familiar with the concept, Lencioni talks about this idea that as leaders rise in organizations, their priorities eventually have to shift. So early in leadership, most leaders, we naturally focus on and bring the majority of our energy toward supporting, protecting, and developing the people who report directly to us. And of course, that still matters deeply because those relationships are incredibly important, and those are the people who are in our care. But as leaders continue advancing into more senior roles, there's another shift that has to happen where our first priority becomes investing in our peers and the broader enterprise leadership team. In other words, leaders have to learn how to take off our functional hat and put on our enterprise leadership hat. And that can feel surprisingly unnatural at first. I know it did for me because success is no longer just about how well your individual team performs in isolation. It becomes much more connected to how well the leadership team functions together overall. How well leaders align, how we collaborate, how we challenge one another, support one another, and think beyond our own lane or function in service of the broader organization. And while that sounds strategic on the surface, and it is, there's something deeply relational underneath it. Because truly functioning with your peers as a first team requires trust. It requires leaders to stop performing all the time and to create enough psychological safety for people to disagree honestly, challenge one another thoughtfully, ask for help when needed, and still remain connected relationally afterward. One of the biggest risks I see in organizational and team effectiveness work is most leadership teams never fully become true first teams. Leaders may work alongside one another every single day while still feeling emotionally guarded with one another. Conversations, they just stay surface level. People protect information. Everyone feels pressure to appear capable and certain all the time. So over time, leaders quietly begin carrying enormous emotional weight privately because the system never created enough safety for leaders to carry it together. And that distinction really matters because leadership was never meant to feel like emotional survival happening. It was meant to feel more like shared stewardship, shared responsibility, and hopefully shared humanity. There's actually significant research around this too. So Gallup has consistently found that having stronger relationships and even one meaningful friendship at work is strongly connected to engagement, to well-being, performance, and overall satisfaction at work. And that research points to something much deeper than simply liking the people you work with. It's deeper than that. We as humans are relational by nature, and leadership becomes much harder to sustain when we feel emotionally disconnected, which we've talked about. Inside these very systems that we spend most of our lives operating within, we need more spaces as leaders inside organizations where we can process honestly, think collaboratively, and feel supported instead of constantly feeling pressure to perform steadiness and certainty all the time. And this is also where vulnerability becomes really important in leadership. Not performative vulnerability or emotional dumping. I'm not talking about showing up to work completely unhinged and uncontained and making everyone else carry the emotions for you or feel the weight of your emotions. What I mean is having the courage to let people see enough of your humanity that real trust and connection becomes possible. Vulnerability with your peers or first team takes practice. It is sometimes looks like asking for help or inviting someone else's perspective before an idea or maybe before a piece of work is fully polished. Sometimes it's about bringing people into the kitchen while you're still thinking something through, or maybe coming up with an idea and letting them in on that instead of feeling pressure to always present that perfect finished product to your peers. Sometimes it's admitting you don't have all the answers, or sometimes it's acknowledging that something was really difficult for you. Or simply it can be allowing people to see your personality, your values, your humor, pulling that armor down a little bit and sharing about the things you genuinely care about outside of work or underneath the role that you play at work. Because if we spend all of our time performing perfection for our coworkers and keeping composed and we're perfectly capable all the time, people will respect us, which is great. We want that respect, but they may never truly feel connected to us. And over time, that emotional distance can deepen the loneliness leaders are already experiencing. The best and the strongest leaders understand that appropriate vulnerability actually creates safety for other people too. It gives our peers and our teams permission to be honest. It creates relatability and trust, and it reminds people that leadership is human, not robotic. Okay. The second thing that feels incredibly important is building grounding relationships outside of your immediate organization or system. And this is what I think of as building your personal board of directors. Not literally, of course, but metaphorically, creating a circle of people in your life outside of work who help you stay grounded, challenged, supported, honest, connected, and emotionally healthy over time. Because one of the things that can happen in mid to senior level leadership is that your world slowly starts getting smaller without us even realizing it. We spend most of our time inside the same organizational dynamics, inside the same conversations, and the same expectations. And over time, it becomes really easy for us to lose perspective and to zoom out. It becomes easy to over-identify with our role, our title, our performance, or the immediate organization that we're operating within. And that's why relationships outside of our organization or our system matter so much. We need people who remind us who we are outside of work, people who tell us the truth, who challenge our thinking in healthy ways, who can expand our perspective, encourage our growth, and remind us that our value as human beings is not solely tied to our achievement, our productivity, or our performance. And as an Enneagram 3, I need that truth telling from my board of directors. Those relationships that I have in my board of directors don't all have to serve the same purpose either, and they don't. Some people on your personal board of directors may be mentors. Some may be peers in different industries. Some may be close friends, maybe former colleagues. And some may simply be people who help you feel more connected to yourself whenever that you're around them. My board of directors, including the Clarity crew, you know who you are, they're incredible. And I am better because I exist in their orbits and they're in my life. Life is so complex and everyone is busy, but being intentional about nurturing these relationships instead of assuming they will maintain themselves automatically is mission critical. And sometimes that looks like setting a reminder once a month to grab coffee with someone you admire or trust. Sometimes it's scheduling a recurring walk, dinner, or a virtual catch-up with someone who helps you think more clearly and feel more grounded afterward. Sometimes it's simply reaching out to someone you respect and saying, I'd love to stay more intentionally connected. There's something that I want to offer you or something I'd like to learn from you. So who are the people that you go to for wisdom? Who helps you stay connected to possibility in your life and your career? Who tells you the truth and who does it with care? Who challenges your thinking in ways that can help you grow? And who makes you feel more like yourself when you leave the conversation? I want you to pause this podcast and I want you to write their names down and really reflect on this because these relationships matter deeply. Back to my experience at the World Conference in Miami, There's that cliche that says iron sharpens iron, and I felt that deeply while I was there because there's something incredibly transformative about being surrounded by people who, again, challenge your thinking, expand your perspective, support your growth, and remind you that you do not have to carry leadership and functional expertise alone in order to be strong. And many leaders underestimate how important it is to intentionally place themselves in rooms like that. Rooms where people are generous with one another, where growth and reflection are valued, and where emotionally intelligent people are more interested in sharing wisdom and sharpening one another than competing with each other. Because the right relationships do more than simply support us emotionally. They stretch us, they reconnect us to possibility and perspective, and often remind us of who we are becoming. And sometimes one meaningful conversation with our board of directors, one mentor, one coach, one peer relationship, or one room full of the right people can completely shift the way we as leaders see ourselves and the way we see the world around us. I am so incredibly grateful for my personal board of directors. And again, you know who you are. The third thing that feels incredibly important, and this is our last one, is engaging in regulative and reflective practices for leaders. And I actually did an entire podcast episode called Why Leaders Need Regulative and Reflective Practices. So if this part of the conversation really resonates with you, I would absolutely encourage you to go back and listen to that episode because there I go much deeper into the science, psychology, and the importance of these practices. But at a super high level, regulative practices are the things that help regulate and ground our nervous system. Things like breath work, movement, walking, prayer, meditation, or anything that helps bring you back to center physiologically and emotionally. Reflective practices, on the other hand, are things that help you process, examine, and understand yourself more intentionally. Things like journaling, therapy, reflection, coaching, meaningful conversations, or just creating the space to slow down, actually think about how you are showing up, what patterns you're repeating, what you're feeling, what you're learning, and who you're becoming. I want to spend a little more time specifically on one aspect of this, which is coaching, because I think coaching is often deeply misunderstood, especially at our most senior levels of leadership. There's this perception sometimes that coaching is only for leaders who are struggling or underperforming, when in reality, many of the strongest and most self-aware leaders actively invest in coaching and developmental support because they understand something really important. Leadership requires somewhere to process, especially at senior levels. The higher leaders rise in organizations, the fewer spaces they have where they can fully think out loud, reflect honestly, process emotions, examine patterns, challenge assumptions, and kind of just explore what's happening underneath the surface. And that reflective space matters because leaders are human beings before they are leaders. We're just like everyone else, right? We bring our histories, our insecurities, our strengths, our fears, our compensation patterns, even our communication habits and our emotional triggers into every room we walk into, whether we realize it or not. And without intentional reflection, it becomes really easy to just lead on autopilot, to repeat patterns unconsciously or become reactive instead of intentional. We can also slowly disconnect from ourselves while remaining highly functional externally. And that's one of the reasons I believe so deeply in coaching. Not because coaches have all the answers, we don't, but because great coaches create space for leaders to reconnect with themselves, to increase their self-awareness, and to lead with greater intentionality. And personally, I think the best coaching and my style of coaching creates support and challenge. We create a container where leaders can process honestly while also being stretched to think differently, communicate more effectively, deepen their self-awareness, and align their leadership more closely with who they actually want to be. If coaching is something you're considering, regardless of where you are in your career, I would strongly encourage you look for someone who is properly trained and credentialed in this work. I am seeing so many people online, in social media, and unfortunately, even in the workplace, calling themselves executive coaches right now. But coaching is a real discipline that requires advanced skill, ethics, self awareness, and a deep developmental understanding of the human experience. I'm really grateful for my training through the Hudson Institute of Coaching and for the foundation that ICF certification really provided me, because this work and this style of coaching is not about giving advice. It's about creating a thoughtful, psychologically safe developmental space where people can explore themselves honestly and grow intentionally. And even outside of formal coaching, leaders need reflective spaces somewhere in their lives. So if it's not coaching, again, it may be therapy, mentorship, journaling, or something else entirely. But leaders need spaces where we can slow down. We can take our armor off just for a moment and reconnect with ourselves outside of our role. Because sustainable leadership is not just built through performance, it's built through awareness and reflection and intentionality. It requires courage and steadiness, discernment, and the ability to navigate complexity. But sustainable leadership also requires connection. It requires that self-awareness. It requires spaces where we can reflect, as I've shared. So if this episode resonated with you in some way, I hope it reminded you to check in with yourself a little more honestly, to invest more intentionally in relationships that ground you, and to create more space for reflection and support. And never underestimate the power of closing your laptop, going outside, feeling the sun on your face and the grass under your feet. And if conversations like this are meaningful to you, whether around executive coaching, team effectiveness, first team dynamics, or leadership development more broadly, I'm always happy to connect and continue the conversation. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. Until next time.